Hi guys, welcome back to Core HTML Mastery. We're going to be talking about tables in this video. So we're generally familiar with the concept of a table from outside of HTML. It's basically a structure for storing data, and it has rows and columns. And we can create such a structure using HTML. Now, unsurprisingly, a HTML table is going to exist inside a table tag. So this is our table element. It won't show anything at this stage because our table doesn't have any data. Now, before we start inputting data into our table, we want to set up the structure of our table. And the way we set up the structure of a table, in some ways it's similar to the way we set up the structure of a whole HTML document, because we have a head, a body, and maybe even a footer if we want to, but these are optional in the case of a table. So let's set up a head, which is a t-head element. And it's considered good practice in HTML to indent child elements. So in this case, refer to table as the parent element because it encompasses everything. T-head is actually a child element, so we're going to indent that slightly. And t-head is going to have some child elements as well. And its main child element is going to be a table row, which we can designate with the tr tag. So this is now a table row inside the table head. And for most tables, you will just have one row inside the head. And now we want to think about columns. And we create columns by adding cells to the specific row that we're operating in. Now, the way that we tag the cells depends on whether we're in the table head or the table body. So just keep in mind that beneath the table head, after we've closed the table head, we're going to have a T body as well. And that's going to be where the main data resides for the table. So both of these are going to have rows. Both of them are going to have individual table cells within those rows. The only difference is the naming. So a cell inside a table header is called th. So we'll refer to this as column 1. And on a new line, we'll add another th. We'll refer to this as column 2. Now we should actually get something on the page if we refresh. So we have a basic table with column 1 and column 2. And now we can think about the individual data that's going to appear as part of the table body. So once again, we need to add rows to this, which we can do with tr. And we can add as many rows as we want. So that could be our first row. We could add a second row here. And once again, we need to include cells on these table body rows. And it's very similar to adding the th cells, but instead we use td. And part of the reason is just so we can style them differently, but also it informs the HTML document or the browser where the headers are on the table. Because keep in mind, we might put the headers at the top of the table, but we could of course create a table where we have the headers on the left side, or we could even have the headers on the right side or the bottom if we really wanted to do that. We wouldn't in most cases, but it's good to designate which cells are header cells and which cells just contain regular table data. So that's why we differentiate between th and td. So we'll put data 1, row 1. And we'll add another cell here. We'll put data 2, row 2. Let's refresh. You can see our table beginning to take shape. And let's add another row. In fact, we will just copy the data here. And we're going to modify this data so it makes sense. So it's going to be, in fact, that should say data 2, row 1. Then we have data 1, row 2, and data 2, row 2. So let's refresh. So you can see the beginnings of a table. Now, it doesn't look very much like a table at the moment, and that's because it doesn't have any styling. So once again, this really steps into the realms of CSS, but because we kind of need a bit of CSS in this case to actually make this look like a table, we are going to add some very basic styling to this document as well. So at the bottom of the document, we're going to have some style tags. So we specify the element we're going to be targeting, which is table in this case. And one thing we can do is add a border, solid 1 pixel black. And you can now see we have an outline on our table. And we can do the same for TD. So we'll target the TD element, we'll do the same, border, solid 1 pixel black. In CSS, there's actually a shortcut here where we could just add TD here, and we separate by comma to indicate that we're styling both of those elements. Now that looks a little bit weird at the moment, because normally we don't have those gaps between the cells in a table. So this is something we'll use specifically for tables, is we'll use a border collapse property, and we'll just specify collapse. Now that starts to look like a table. We can add as many rows as we want to. For example, let's add another column to our table. So we'll add th, column 3. Now what happens if we add the additional column, but we don't add corresponding data to the table. Let's take a look. So you can see at the moment it's just completely blank. So let's add an extra cell to each of the rows. Let's name the cell accordingly. So this is data 3, row 1, and this is data 3, row 2. So that's pretty much how to create the data structure for a table in HTML. As mentioned, we can have a tfoot as well. So let's add a tfoot element. And inside that table footer, well, we can do what we want really. For example, what happens if we just add one, and we'll call it totals of all columns. Let's refresh. And as you can see at the moment, it actually takes up just one column by default. Imagine, for example, we wanted that footer of the table to take up the entire row. So we have 3 cells in each row, but for the footer, we actually just want 1 row for the table, for example. So for this, we can make use of a colspan attribute. So colspan equals, and the number of columns we want it to occupy. So for example, if we specify 3, that will now take up the full width of the table. If we were to specify 2, it now just takes up the first 2 columns of the table. We can also do something similar with the vertical space that these cells take up. So for example, we could add a row span of 2. So same as colspan, but Rowspan. So that's on data 1, row 1. So let's see what happens. So it now takes up 2 in terms of vertical space, but notice what happens to line 2 or row 2. That now technically has 4 pieces of data because the first piece of data is bleeding over into the second row. So we technically have 4 data points on that second row, which is messing up the layout of the table a bit here. So let's see what happens if we delete one of the data points from the second row of the table. Now you can see our table makes sense. You can actually create some fairly interesting structures using the default HTML and then using some attributes like Rowspan and colspan. For full details on everything you can do with tables, we're going to need to unleash some CSS styling. We looked at some very basic CSS styling just so it actually looks like a table, but check out the core CSS mastery course if you want the full information on how to style a table. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.